In September 1983, the Polish Pope, John Paul II, came to this church to pray. He did so because almost exactly 300 years earlier to the day, on the 11th of September 1683, a regiment of Polish hussars also gathered at this same spot to offer prayers. It was the eve of a tremendous battle between two great armies. On the one hand, the military might of the Muslim Ottoman Empire, and on the other, an alliance of Christian forces from across Europe, in which the Polish contingent would play a pivotal role. The battle, which commenced in the early hours of the following morning, would come to be seen as one of the defining moments in European history, the after effects of which continue to reverberate to this day. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was a devastating blow to Christian Europe. The people of Osman had transformed themselves into a great imperial power. With Constantinople, rechristened Istanbul, as their capital, the Ottomans stood on the threshold of a golden era, largely brought about by the vision of one man, Sultan Suleiman I, known by many as Suleiman the Magnificent. In 1520, Suleiman inherited a sprawling empire that stretched from the borders of Hungary in the northwest to Crimea in the northeast and across the Levant into Egypt.
Suleiman was one of the greatest Ottoman sultans. He was a very intelligent man and a very ambitious man, and he had huge resources on his side.
He brought the Ottoman Empire to the height of civilization. He did a lot of building projects, mosques, bathhouses, social institutions.
We know that he sponsored the production of loads of beautiful arts and artworks. When people went to visit him, they described him sitting on cloths of gold and wearing a ruby the size of a hazelnut with a pearl the size of a hazelnut dangling from his ear. So he was a man who obviously enjoyed the good things of life.
One of Suleiman's greatest achievements was to bring stability and prosperity to a vast and culturally diverse empire. To get an idea of daily life during Suleiman's time, I'm visiting the tiny village of Jumaliksik, here in northern Anatolia. Unchanged for hundreds of years, this is about as close as you can get to travelling back in time. Before film, TV, and of course the internet, shadow puppet theatre was the #1 entertainment across the empire. Following time-honoured plots and characters, the plays offer a unique insight into the nature of Ottoman society. I'm watching this one with Ugo Jellicoe, who comes from a long line of Turkish puppeteers.
Karagöz and Hacivat are the main characters of the play. Karagöz represents somebody in the street, and Hacivat is an educated man. So these two men, first of all, are organizing all these funny things. In this play, for example, Karagöz and Hacivat are in collaboration in order to earn money, so they put up a swing, and Hacivat sends different characters to Karagöz.
Well, were there kind of regional differences, man? Was there a special kind of theatre for the Balkans?
Well, I think it was almost the same throughout the empire, but as you know, Ottoman Empire started growing and many different nationalities were living together. As a result of that, we can see Albanians, we have Greek characters, we have Arabs, we have Kurdish, we can see a Jewish character, for instance. We have all these different nationalities and characters. Here we have the tax collector, and he is the Ottoman official. The whole place is going really funny, but right in the middle of everything, he says, don't forget to pay your tax.
The theatre must have performed a very valuable role as a sort of safety valve for letting off steam and also for actually changing things around.
I think so. It was like a television. People were getting news from there. A puppeteer can speak about everything, even he can criticize the governmental system, the Sultan himself. So I think that's very important, and maybe this is something we don't have today.
One secret of the success was the tolerance. There was no pressure on turning Christian populations into Muslims, because Christians did pay higher taxes than Muslims.
Ethnicity is not important. As long as you paid your taxes, nobody is going to interfere with you because of your religious beliefs.
In spite of the empire's stability, Suleiman was bent on expansion. But a formidable rival was emerging in Europe that would complicate his plans: the Habsburg King Charles V. Appointed Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 1519, Charles presided over a vast territory, including Spain and its emergent American colonies, the Netherlands, and swathes of Germany, Italy, Austria, and Hungary. As the two leaders prepared for war, the scene was set for a clash of egos and ambitions that would play out on an epic scale. In 1521, Suleiman made his first move in Europe by taking the city of Belgrade on the fringes of the Habsburg Empire. But Suleiman had a much bigger prize in his sights: Vienna, a key city in the heart of the eastern half of Charles's Holy Roman domains. Known as the Golden Apple, Vienna was the gateway to Central Europe, and its capture would not only open the door to further European incursions, but deliver a powerful blow to Habsburg hegemony in the region. Success, however, would require patience and a strategy. Suleiman had both.
Suleiman is looking for allies against the Habsburgs, and the natural ally is the King of France.
France was surrounded by Habsburg territories. They really felt menaced by this overwhelming power. And it's a very old political trick. The enemy of your enemy is my friend.
The French and the Ottomans agreed trade treaties which allowed the French a presence in Istanbul and the ability to trade. The quid pro quo for this is the French give Suleiman the use of ports in the south of France from which to raid the Mediterranean, and this does a great deal of damage.
At the same time, the Protestant Reformation was sweeping across Christian Europe, affording Suleiman further divisions to exploit.
The Ottomans saw the Protestants as being natural allies, and they did make overtures to the Protestants of Northern Europe. After England becomes a Protestant country, there were overtures made on the basis that Spain is now England's enemy, and Elizabeth sent ambassadors and gifts to the Ottoman sultans.
A lot of Protestant rulers or noblemen preferred an Ottoman rule than a Habsburg Catholic rule because of tolerance. If you had to pay higher taxes to the Ottomans or being burned on the stake, you preferred higher taxes.
But what we see here really is Europe breaking down from a pan-Christian front that the crusading idea has died and people are now nation-states. And so the deals that they're making are in their personal national interest.
Keen to exploit European disunity, Suleiman initiated his plan of attack by taking on the defiant kingdom of Hungary. Allied with Austria, it was the one obstacle that stood between him and Vienna. As Suleiman and his armies crossed the Danube, a Habsburg-Hungarian force rallied to meet them here, outside the tiny village of Mohacs in southern Hungary. What became known as the Battle of Mohacs would be a national tragedy for Hungary that reverberates to this day. "25 years of misrule by a weak and ineffectual king had left Hungary divided. The peasants were in near revolt, the aristocrats, they were fighting amongst each other. The incoming king, Louis II, he was just 19 years of age and he was inexperienced in the art of statecraft and military campaigning. He managed to raise a fighting force of 30,000 men, but that was just half the number of the Ottoman force. The field of the battle is memorialized here in this rather strange and disquieting monument. The terrible battle that ensued is seared into the Hungarian collective consciousness. The Hungarian forces were no match against the superior might of Suleiman's armies, and within just a few hours of the battle's commencement, they were destroyed. In a final tragic twist, the young Hungarian King Louis, while attempting to flee to safety, was thrown from his horse and died. The Battle of Mohacs was a tragedy for Hungary, but a resounding victory for the Ottomans. Suleiman now controlled the southern half of the kingdom, providing him with a strong base for further campaigns into Habsburg territory. And just 3 years later, his armies were on the move again. In the summer of 1529, they swept northward, capturing the Hungarian capital Buda, and by September, they were outside the gates of Vienna itself. It was an audacious act that took the city by surprise.
Vienna was very ill-prepared for this siege. It still had a medieval fortress, it had not too many troops in it, and the Turkish army was enormous. It was about 200,000 men.
From their headquarters in St. Stephen's Cathedral, the Viennese commanders looked on in horror as the Ottomans began to bombard their city. The defenders, for their part, put up a heroic resistance, and they kept the Turkish army at bay for several weeks. But there was a limit to how long they could hold out. Defeat seemed inevitable, until at the 11th hour, fortune came to them in the form of bad weather. Torrential rain and early snowfall forced the Ottomans to abandon the siege. According to some defenders, divine providence had favored the Christians.
Heaven helped the Viennese. It was pouring rain. If the Turkish army would have been smaller, maybe Vienna would have fallen. But you had to feed 200,000 men and 100,000 beasts. And this by very bad roads, mud, great difficulties in supply lines.
Suleiman's failure to take Vienna proved at least one thing, that the Ottoman military machine was not invincible. And the Viennese, along with half of Europe, breathed a hefty sigh of relief. But Suleiman was nothing if not determined, and over the next 25 years, he made at least one further attempt to take the city. But this time he didn't even get there. His armies were bogged down in Hungary, stalled by bad weather and the defiant resistance of the Hungarians. It seemed that Suleiman's dream of plucking the golden apple from its bough was doomed. But his resolve was undiminished. Suleiman the Magnificent would take Vienna or die trying. It wasn't until the summer of 1566 that Suleiman, at the ripe old age of 72, would assemble the largest Ottoman army to date and set off in the direction of Vienna once again.
What was interesting was that Suleiman went on campaign. He hadn't been on campaign for, I can't remember, for a decade. And suddenly, at the end of his life, he feels a need to go out there and show his face to the troops, really. And I read that as being something significant about his presence or lack of presence in the public eye.
Suleiman was very old to go to a campaign, but he believed that he himself is the ultimate commander. He should lead his army. And so he felt himself as being a soldier, as a center of his meaning as a ruler.
Crossing the Danube, Suleiman's forces descended on the relatively insignificant fortress town of Sigurðar. It should have been an easy victory, but Sigurðar had been a thorn in the Ottoman side for decades, resisting capture time and time again, which prevented previous campaigns from reaching Vienna. At the center of its defense was a well-fortified citadel. In Suleiman's mind, it was time this annoying molehill was leveled. But few could have predicted at the outset of the siege the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. Events that would see the little town of Sigurðar go down as the stuff of legend. With less than 3,000 soldiers, Sigurðar was no match for Suleiman's forces. But it did have some advantages. Surrounded by a lake, the town was laid out across 3 fortified islands. The Ottomans managed to take the first 2 islands relatively quickly, forcing the surviving townsfolk and soldiers to take refuge in the citadel. With only 300 soldiers remaining, the defenders' Croatian commander, Miklos Hrinji, faced an impossible task. To get a Hungarian take on this legendary battle, I'm meeting author and journalist Cecilia Hazai. Cecilia, these are pretty impressive fortifications. Tell me something about their arrangement, how they worked.
See, what you see today is not what it once was. Imagine it was surrounded by a huge lake. The Ottomans, when they arrived here, they started drying this whole water up. Took them a good 2.5, 3 weeks before they could actually start attacking the fort.
Tell me what happened next.
The Turks fired into the fort, and a massive fire broke out because they actually attacked their artillery equipment. So this fire was burning, hope was dying. So the only way for the Hungarian defenders was to break out of the fort and sacrifice their lives. They talked about it, they prepared for it, mentally, they dressed up, prayed, and just opened the gates and charged out of the fort to certain death. Zrinji was shot twice, and the Turks swiftly grabbed him, put him over a cannon, and beheaded him.
So obviously a very heroic, if kind of gruesome death for Zrinji.
Absolutely, but the Hungarian boys left a nice little surprise for the Ottomans because they knew they would charge into the fort. So they stuffed this one room with a bunch of explosives. The Ottoman soldiers came into the fort, or what remained of it, opened this room, and this just blew up and thousands died.
And of course, Suleiman himself had died that very same morning.
Yes, but nobody knew about it. They had to keep it secret. If the soldiers, the Ottoman soldiers, find out that the Sultan has died, looting, rebellion, you can imagine what happens. They managed to keep it secret for over 2 weeks. They had him buried quickly. It was still summer, it was warm, you know. A dead body rots in half an hour. They took the heart out as well as some inner organs, and legend has it that they put it in some golden bowl and buried that separately.
Suleiman's army captured Sigurðar, but at a price. Not only had they suffered enormous losses, but their sultan had died, not in battle, but of illness. The push to Vienna was abandoned. Suleiman's dream left unfulfilled.
It's a kind of melancholy conclusion to Suleiman's life. Almost the last words in his journal are, smoke is still coming from the chimneys of Sigetvar, and that he dies trying to conquer this tiny little place, which is only defended by 2,000 people, and almost like a failure. It sort of represents a failure of the conquest project.
The new Sultan, Mehmed IV, and his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, became obsessed with capturing Vienna. But their motives were complex.
By the time we get to the 17th century, the rhetoric of holy war is still being used by the Ottomans, but it's kind of a bit more measured by this time. It's more imperial. The grudge match is still going on with the Habsburg dynasty, and that this is a place, this obsessive return to this place that is just beyond reach, really, that will legitimize an empire which is starting to fall behind.
When Kara Mustafa came to power, he had one great disadvantage. He was not a professional general. He was a courtier. So he wanted to prove to all these great generals who came from the Janitsar Corps that he's as good as they are. And so he wanted to conquer something which was very prestigious, which was Vienna.
In the summer of 1683, Kara Mustafa and an Ottoman army of several 100,000 set off from Edirne to capture Vienna. It would become the largest army to have ever besieged a European city. As news of the Ottoman advance reached Vienna, panic swept across the city. Tens of thousands evacuated, including reigning Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I and his family. The task of defending the city fell to seasoned Viennese Field Marshal Ernst Rudiger von Starrenberg. He was faced with a formidable logistical challenge. It was a little over 1.5 centuries since Suleiman had laid siege to Vienna. And in the intervening years, the Viennese had completely upgraded their defences. They rebuilt the city walls, incorporating the latest advances in military engineering. This is one of the last surviving sections of those walls. But even at the moment of their completion, they were redundant. The art of warfare had moved on, and the rules of engagement had changed completely. So, in spite of the evident sturdiness of these great city walls, Vienna was really in no position to withstand a full frontal attack by the might of the Ottoman army. On July the 14th, 1683, the watchmen of Vienna looked out from their perch atop St. Stephen's Cathedral. The Ottomans had the city surrounded, a vast army, the like of which few Viennese had ever seen. The battle commenced with a thunderous cannonade directed at the city walls, but many of the cannonballs also flew into the heart of the city, bringing down church spires. For the faithful praying for salvation below, it was a hellish din, the sound of Armageddon. As the bombardment raged above ground, a strange subterranean campaign was unfolding beneath the city. The Ottomans had hundreds of sappers who built a network of trenches which enabled them to move the infantry and the artillery close up to the city walls. The trenches were effective to a point, but if they got too close to the fortifications, the men inside would be sitting ducks, open to fire from the parapets above. So the sappers dug tunnels deep underground in an effort to reach the foundation of the city walls. Once there, they would plant explosives to bring the walls down. These Ottoman sappers were real professionals. Many of them were recruited from the Serbian mines, so they knew a thing or two about digging holes, laying explosives. And they could work really fast with great precision, which would take them under the city walls. It was a curious kind of subterranean warfare waged in the dark, but it could prove devastating when it came off.
So, let's go downwards to the exciting part of the city.
The sappers posed tremendous problems for Vienna's defenders, but there was a way to counteract them, and it lay deep beneath the city, in a labyrinthine network of underground cellars and passageways. Local guide Peter Harbinger is showing me a section of the old tunnels that runs beneath a bakery in the heart of the city.
These tunnels, as you can see here, played an important role in the time of the Ottoman siege, because we are now here very close to the city's fortifications. And the idea was to sit down here and listening if some counter-digging of the Ottoman miners could be heard here down in the cellar.
So you said the Viennese were down here in these tunnels listening, so they just pressed their ears to the wall? Or?
No, there are special measures, special methods. For example, drums. They were placed here in front of the wall with dry peas on it.
Peas?
Peas, yeah. They were dry peas, and they were on the surface of the drum. And when there was a digging, when the Ottoman miners started the digging and the mines blasting, then suddenly the peas began to rattle.
Right. Okay.
And the rattling of the peas indicates there's someone coming.
Okay, so they know there's someone out there coming through the earth. What do they do next?
Yeah, they started their digging from the inside of the wall, so they could find the Ottoman miners, and they could defeat them and kill them in there.
I mean, it means what we see here is behind the brick facing of the tunnel, and we're into solid rock, so very difficult to penetrate. It
was a hard work, yeah. They used gunpowder. Yes. To get in there. So there always the danger that something might happen. Some shooting, some fire, some explosion, maybe the tunnel crushing down. So it must be a tremendous situation down there.
Yeah, I mean, what you've described is a hellish scenario. I mean, confined space, these tunnels that they were building were narrow and dirt and just the flickering flames. And then suddenly you meet your enemy face to face, underground, and you kill them.
Yeah. So we have a very famous legend here in Vienna, and it tells us the story of a young baker boy who was working down here, because we are now here in the cellar of a bakery. And he was working during the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, as bakers usually do. And he was the first. He was standing here. We have these drums with the peas on, and he heard the drums. He heard the rattling of the drums. Right. So he knew there's danger coming. He was the first, and he gave alarm and said, "Alarm, they are coming." And so later on, the bakers were honored for this reason, because they helped the city. And this story is told to every child and every day in school, for example. So it's a very famous one, and we like it because it's a nice idea, being saved by a baker boy.
Baker boys, yeah, right, exactly. The Ottomans bombarded the city, both above and below ground, for 2 months. Despite their best efforts, the defenders couldn't hold out for much longer. The writing was all over the city's crumbling walls. Without a game changer, Vienna was doomed.
The Turkish were able to almost conquer one of the bastions and destroy a second bastion. The last wall was 1 day or 2 days before it would have been breached. So it was very, very close.
Salvation, if it were to come, would be riding a horse. Long-awaited relief forces were heading to Vienna, and among them was one of the most accomplished and respected cavalry in Europe, the Polish Hussars. Under the command of King John Sobieski, the Hussars were renowned for their bravery and horsemanship in battle. Today, they're still a source of great pride in Poland, and the Living History Reenactment Group of GNU are dedicated to keeping their legacy alive. But before we see them in action, I'm getting a lesson in 17th century Polish warfare. Well, I'm here with Jarek and his Hussars. And Eric, I want to go back 300 years to the eve of the Battle of Vienna. So turn me into a hussar, please.
We will have to prepare you for
Yes.
the battle. Christian, Župan. The name of this part is Župan.
The hussars' uniform was built for speed and versatility. Their armour, weighing roughly 15 kilos, was actually considered lightweight for its day. I feel like a lobster there. Manoeuvrability was essential for the range of weaponry used.
And now I would like to give you the most beautiful weapon of our Polish noble. Polish saber.
For those higher-ranking soldiers, like me, animal pelts were worn and, of course, a solid piece of headgear.
How do you feel?
Very encumbered.
Yeah?
Yeah, how can you fight like this? I can't move my head.
Firstly, you will have to practice with the pistols.
And this was carried on the side of the horse.
Yeah.
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 So you only really have one shot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only one.
Yeah.
If you've got two pistols,
Yeah, two
shots.
shots.
Yeah, so we can try.
Okay, so right, right, I better not point at anybody.
Yeah.
And I would just, wow, great, like that.
Yeah.
But the hussars' most important weapon was the lance. With some of the longest lances ever used in battle, the hussars were feared for their terrifying charges.
And now I would like to give to your hands the Queen of Polish Husaria, the Polish lance,
And the length of this?
about 6 meters long.
Right.
Do it.
Okay.
The right hand is for the lance, the left for the horse.
For the horse, yeah.
Do you
Well,
feel the power of Polish army?
I feel the weakness in my right arm. I'm curious about spiking the enemy through. I mean, okay, so
We've got one experience
Yeah.
in 1660
Yeah.
during the Battle of Połanka.
Yeah.
One Polish hussar spiked
Yeah.
6 soldiers
on his lance.
on his lance.
He must be very strong to carry 6 men all on the lance of the
Yeah.
same, like a kebab.
Yeah. Without onion.
By early September, Sobieski and his hussars reached the outskirts of Vienna, where they joined a large force of Habsburg armies drawn from other parts of the empire. As the city walls were beginning to crumble, the relief force sprang into action. Time was of the essence, and the Habsburg relief force needed to engage their enemy at the very first opportunity. And so it was decided that they would launch their attack on the Ottoman encampment from these heavily wooded hills to the west of the city, the Vienna. But it was a risky strategy, because in order to reach the summit, they had to pass through dense forest and along narrow ravines, which could have been disastrous had they been ambushed. But Kara Mustafa was so engrossed with his siege of the city, his focus on Vienna, that he completely neglected to consider the possibility of an attack from without. And so the relief forces were able to gain the higher ground unopposed. Spreading out across the hilltops northwest of Vienna, the Habsburg relief armies were able to gain a commanding view of the enemy and the bombardment of the city below. And a pretty daunting sight it must have seemed as well, with a vast Ottoman host encamped in the valley surrounding Vienna, and a constant cannonade of Ottoman artillery blasting away at walls, billows of smoke rolling up the hills. And this is where the main army had to come down, descending through vineyards and crossing stony ground, and then at the bottom, the Ottomans. Okay, they may not have been prepared for this attack, but when they were there was a huge army of soldiers waiting to meet the relief force. But then, further along the ridge, was King Sobieski's Polish hussars, and they were going to charge down a valley and attack the Ottoman host from the flank. And this was going to be a game changer. On the night of September the 11th, 1683, King Sobieski and his hussars came to the site of St. Joseph's Church, here in the hills overlooking Vienna, to pray before commencing their attack. The Poles were staunch Catholics, loyal to the Pope, defenders to their dying breath of Christendom and the Holy Roman Empire. For them, this was a conflict between the forces of good and evil, whose outcome could only be decided by God.
The bulk of Habsburg forces made the first assault from the hills to the north of the city. As Kara Mustafa rallied his troops to meet them, the Polish Hussars made their move. Reaching a valley to the southwest, they began their terrifying charge, directly into the rear of the Ottoman encampment. Panic spread amongst the Ottoman troops, who were unprepared for the double-pronged attack. As for Kara Mustafa, realizing the disaster unfolding before him, he retreated in disarray. His armies, overwhelmed by the surprise attack, followed closely behind. In an astonishing act of bravery, not least on the part of the Polish Hussars, Vienna was saved.
Kara Mustafa made a lot of mistakes because he was not a trained soldier. He didn't concentrate all his troops in defending his camp against the assaulting relief army, but continued the assault to the city because it was so close for the fall. So he divided his force, which was technically a mistake.
From the sumptuous interior of the Grand Vizier's tent, King Sobieski penned letters of the triumphant victory for the leaders of Europe. His immortal words, inspired by Julius Caesar, came to define the victory for Christendom. We came, we saw, God conquered.
For most Europeans, this was a defining moment. Christianity had prevailed, and Europe had been saved from the infidel Turk. This was the rhetoric of churchmen and princes, but it was also a popular sentiment. Good had triumphed over evil. It was divine providence. They had God on their side.
I think this is a watershed moment. There was a great deal of rejoicing throughout Europe as far away as Barcelona and England and so on. It also really put the Austrians on the front foot.
The Second Siege didn't unite Christian Europe, but it helped enormously the prestige of the Austrian Empire.
In their hasty retreat, the Ottoman army left behind a wealth of artifacts, and you can find many of them on display here in the Vienna Museum. To get a better understanding of the battle, I'm visiting the museum with historian Matthias Pfaffenbichler.
This is very interesting because those are horse tails and they are signs of command for high-ranking Turkish commanders. The number of horse tails will tell the people his rank.
How would these have been carried? Would there have been a standard
on a horse.
Right. Yeah.
So
this looks a very intriguing device with lots of spikes. It looks like some terrible weapon, but perhaps it's not.
No, it's no weapon. The spikes are just to hold some inflammable material around it. So you can easily ignite it, and it's a signal post. And then you can inflame it, and it gives a fire. Right. If there's a fire, everybody has to rush through his cannons.
These lancers over here, they're
very nice.
Beautifully decorated. They were recovered from the field of battle.
Yes, they were recovered from the field of battle because the Turkish cavalry fled in panic and they left these wonderful lances, and it was the Polish who started plundering the camp.
Even before the battle was resolved?
Was finished, yes. Because for everybody, if you could plunder and get something very rich, it's for your lifetime. So the Polish got really the best things out of it. Kara Mustafa made the greatest mistake of not counterattacking because the whole Polish troops was useless because of plundering. So if he would have counterattacked, maybe he would have won the battle.
As for Kara Mustafa, his failure was not well received by the Sultan. He was executed the traditional way, strangled with a silk cord and then beheaded.
According to some accounts, the head of Kara Mustafa was stolen and brought back to Vienna, where it became an object of amusement in royal court circles. It was used as a football in polo matches, that kind of thing. And there was actually a head kept at this museum until about 10 years ago, allegedly that of Kara Mustafa. But I believe since then it's been buried as more modern sensibilities prevailed. And he's got a rather mournful expression. It's almost as if he had a premonition of his fate. Tough luck.
But the legacy of the siege is not confined to museums. It has left its mark everywhere in Vienna, and stories surrounding the battle have come to define the city's character in many ways. One legend claims that while hussars were ransacking the Ottoman encampment, they came across a curious cache, sacks filled with small bean-like pellets. Little did they realize it was coffee. As a result, Vienna opened its first coffee house using the very coffee discovered in the Ottoman encampment. Another legend holds that those baker boys who saved Vienna devised a commemorative cake to celebrate the victory. Designed to mock the Ottoman emblem, the cake was crescent-shaped, thereby giving birth to the croissant. A century later, the novel cake would be introduced to France by the Habsburg princess Marie Antoinette. And the rest is history. Oh, danke schön. Fantastic. Great. Jolly good. Well, if local legend is to be believed, the enduring legacy of the Battle of Vienna is the continental breakfast. We have the coffee and the croissant. The Ottoman failure to take Vienna marked a turning point in the fortunes of both Austria and the Ottoman Empire. As the Habsburgs' new capital, Vienna entered an imperial and cultural golden age. While the city celebrated its fortunes with ever more grandiose buildings and monuments, the Ottomans, it seemed, had hit a wall. And for a brief period, Europe seemed united in its determination to rid the continent of the Turk. In 1686, European forces retook Buda, and by the beginning of the 18th century, regained most of Hungary.
There was awareness within the Ottoman state that they were no longer way ahead of everybody. Maybe they were even falling behind. Maybe their military systems were a bit passé.
The pendulum is starting to swing back the other way, and so there's a feeling that the Ottoman threat is starting to recede.
The Ottoman Empire had reached the geographic limits of their expansion.
The tables appeared to have turned in Europe's favour. But the conflict was far from over. The Ottomans were still a formidable force. No one, however, could have foreseen the unlikely alliance they would forge with Western Europe in the face of a new menace rising in the east. In the third and last episode, we follow the Ottoman Empire's final centuries, a period defined by a desperate power struggle with Tsarist Russia.